In the quiet hours before dawn, the sprawling campus of Fairview College seemed undisturbed by the chaos about to unfold. A prestigious institution nestled in the outskirts of Cedar Grove, it was known for its academic excellence and competitive sports programs. On a chilly March morning, the peaceful campus woke to a grim discovery: a body, lifeless and sprawled across the synthetic grass of the football field. That body belonged to Coach Harris, a man admired and feared in equal measure. Coach Harris had been found with multiple gunshot wounds, his blood staining the field where he once commanded the respect of his players. Students who adored him for his unwavering dedication were left speechless. The athletic department was paralyzed by shock, while the broader student body whispered in hushed tones about the man whose personal life had been a well-guarded secret. Coach Harris had been a fixture at Fairview for over a decade, a mentor to countless athletes and a man whose leadership had earned him a reputation of near reverence. Yet, like many revered figures, his life off the field remained something of an enigma. Yet he kept his personal affairs under wraps, only known to a select few who ventured into his inner circle. One of those select few was Daniel Fisher, a star athlete under Coach Harris's guidance. Daniel had transferred to Fairview 2 years earlier, lured by the school's sterling athletic program and the promise of a fresh start. A gifted football player, Daniel was also deeply isolated, a result of his struggle with his sexual orientation in a conservative community. Coach Harris became a lifeline for Daniel, offering not only athletic mentorship but also a form of emotional support that transcended their player-coach dynamic. However, as news of Harris's death spread, it wasn't long before suspicions grew. The coach's violent end pointed towards something far darker than the public image of the beloved mentor. Questions emerged about his relationship with Daniel, a relationship that soon proved to be more than professional. What began as a mutual respect between coach and player had evolved into something far more intimate, though hidden from the prying eyes of the campus community. It was a revelation that would throw Fairview College into deeper turmoil, unraveling a complex web of secrecy, jealousy, and betrayal. No one could have anticipated the storm that was brewing beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic college campus. The tragedy of Coach Harris's death wasn't just about a mentor lost too soon, it was a story of human emotions taken to their extreme. Unbeknownst to most, Daniel wasn't the only person close to Harris. A new transfer student, Jacob Wright, had entered the scene, bringing with him an unpredictable energy that would prove catastrophic. What began as an innocent introduction between student and coach turned into something much more dangerous, with Jacob unknowingly stepping into an already fraught dynamic. Jacob's arrival marked the beginning of an emotional tug-of-war that would pull Daniel and Harris into a spiral of jealousy and possessiveness. Daniel, once Harris's trusted confidant, found himself increasingly sidelined, while Jacob's to draw more of the coach's attention. The student-athlete community noticed the shift, but no one could have predicted how the rising tension between these three individuals would culminate in tragedy. Fairview's peaceful facade was about to be torn apart, revealing the darker undercurrents of emotion and manipulation that led to a fatal confrontation. This was not just a crime of passion, but a devastating chain reaction set off by unchecked emotions, leaving behind scars that would never fully heal. As investigators began to piece together the events leading up to Coach Harris's murder, they uncovered a series of connections that painted a far more complicated picture than a simple crime of passion. At the heart of the case was Daniel Fisher, the talented athlete, whose relationship with Harris had evolved into something both deeply personal and, as some suspected, fraught with tension. Daniel had long struggled to fit in, not only at Fairview but throughout his life. His transfer to the college had been motivated by the opportunity to leave behind a past riddled with bullying and social isolation. Harris had taken Daniel under his wing, recognizing the young man's raw talent, but also his vulnerability. Over time, their relationship grew closer, eventually blurring the lines between mentor and lover. It was a secret they had both guarded fiercely, knowing the repercussions of such a revelation would be catastrophic, especially in the hyper-masculine world of college athletics. Yet, as much as Harris provided support to Daniel, their relationship was far from perfect. Harris, though admired for his coaching prowess, had a reputation for being emotionally distant, even controlling. Daniel, yearning for validation, often found himself caught in an emotional push and pull that left him questioning his own worth. But he stayed close to Harris, both out of loyalty and fear of being cast aside once again. Then came Jacob Wright, a rising star in his own right. Jacob was the latest in a long line of athletes Harris had mentored, but unlike others, his arrival coincided with an unsettling shift in Harris's demeanor. Jacob's presence introduced a new strain on the already fragile relationship between Daniel and Harris. The coach's attention gradually shifted toward Jacob, sparking a jealousy in Daniel that grew more intense with each passing week. Witnesses later recalled seeing Daniel's mood change drastically in the weeks leading up to the murder. Friends noticed his increasingly erratic behavior, withdrawn one moment, explosively angry the next. Rumors began to circulate among the students, though no one knew the full extent of what was happening behind closed doors. The tension was palpable, but no one could have foreseen the violent breaking point that was fast approaching. Behind the scenes, Harris was struggling to maintain control of a situation he no longer fully understood. His feelings toward Daniel had become complicated, and his attraction to Jacob had only made matters worse. What had begun as a mentorship quickly turned into a dangerous game of manipulation and emotional warfare. Harris, who thrived on control, found himself at the mercy of two young men whose lives were becoming dangerously intertwined with his own. On the night of the murder, Fairview College lay under a blanket of silence, typical of a mid-semester weekday. The football field, where so many triumphs and heartbreaks had played out under the roaring crowd, now sat empty and eerily still. It was here, in this arena of competition, that Coach Harris would take his last breath. Daniel Fisher had been brooding for days, consumed by a toxic mixture of jealousy, betrayal, and fear. His relationship with Harris had been strained beyond repair ever since Jacob Wright had come into the picture. Harris's attention, once solely focused on him, had shifted toward Jacob, igniting a jealousy that Daniel struggled to control. But it wasn't just jealousy, it was the sting of abandonment. After everything they had shared, everything Daniel had sacrificed to stay close to Harris, he was now being discarded, like so many others before him. On that fateful evening, Daniel decided to confront Harris. His hands were trembling as he approached the coach's office, located just off the field in the athletic department building. He had no plan in mind, only a desire to demand answers, to force Harris to explain why he had turned his back on him. But when he reached the office, the door was slightly ajar, and inside, he saw something that would push him over the edge. Jacob was there, standing close to Harris, their body language unmistakably intimate. What Daniel witnessed was more than just a conversation, it was a betrayal in its rawest form. The anger that had been simmering inside him for weeks finally boiled over. He didn't care about the consequences anymore. He wanted to hurt them the way he was hurting. Daniel stormed into the room, shouting accusations at both Harris and Jacob. The scene quickly devolved into a heated argument, with Harris trying to de-escalate the situation, his usual calm authority crumbling in the face of Daniel's rage. Jacob, meanwhile, remained quiet, his presence alone enough to inflame Daniel further. In that moment, the years of emotional turmoil, the secrets, the manipulation, it all came crashing down. What happened next would be the turning point. As the argument grew more intense, Harris made a desperate attempt to take control of the situation. He moved toward Daniel, trying to physically restrain him, but in doing so, he only intensified Daniel's anger. In the heat of the moment, Harris uttered something that would seal his fate, a harsh dismissal, a confirmation of Daniel's worst fears, that their relationship had been nothing more than a temporary indulgence for the coach. Blinded by rage, Daniel lashed out, pushing Harris with a force he hadn't intended. The coach stumbled backward, but before anyone could react, Jacob made his move. In an act of impulsive violence, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a small firearm, and without hesitation, fired multiple shots. The sound echoed across the empty field, loud enough to be heard by a few students still lingering nearby, but by the time anyone arrived, it was already too late. Harris lay on the ground, his body riddled with gunshot wounds, blood pooling around him as the once pristine turf absorbed the evidence of the crime. Jacob, his hands trembling, stood over him, the weight of what he had done sinking in too late. Daniel, frozen in shock, could hardly comprehend what had just happened. In mere seconds, everything had spiraled out of control, leaving Harris dead and two young men forever changed by the violence they had unleashed. When campus security arrived on the scene minutes later, it was a chaotic blur. Both Daniel and Jacob were arrested on the spot, though the exact details of what had transpired wouldn't come to light until the investigation began. It wasn't long before the media descended upon Fairview College, turning the once quiet campus into a hotspot of sensational news coverage. Headlines screamed of scandal, betrayal, and murder, painting Coach Harris as both a victim and a man whose secrets had finally caught up to him. But as the investigation unfolded, the real story was far more complex than the media's simplistic portrayal. What had driven Jacob to murder Harris wasn't just jealousy, it was a toxic combination of manipulation, unrequited emotions, and the coach's own recklessness in blurring professional lines with personal desires. On the days following the murder, investigators delved deep into the personal lives of those involved, searching for the root of the violence that had erupted on Fairview's campus. It didn't take long for them to uncover the complex relationships that had formed between Coach Harris, Daniel Fisher, and Jacob Wright. What was once a story about a tragic shooting soon became something much darker, as the media uncovered the inappropriate and clandestine relationships between the mentor and his young proteges. The town of Cedar Grove, which prided itself on the reputation of Fairview College, was thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight. Reporters camped outside the campus gates, eager to unearth every sordid detail. Students and faculty were interviewed, rumors flew, and slowly, the true nature of Coach Harris's relationships with his players came to light. The public's image of the beloved coach was shattered. Daniel Fisher, once seen as the victim of a tragic crime, now found himself at the center of a moral scandal. His relationship with Harris, initially framed as that of a troubled athlete seeking guidance from a mentor, was revealed to be far more personal and intimate. It became clear that the emotional entanglement between Daniel and Harris had been brewing for some time, with Harris using his authority to maintain control over Daniel, both on and off the field. Jacob Wright's role in the tragedy was equally complex. Investigators learned that Harris had been grooming Jacob in much the same way he had with Daniel, manipulating the young man's feelings while keeping him on the hook for future opportunities within the athletic program. Jacob, overwhelmed by a mixture of admiration and romantic feelings for Harris, had become increasingly unstable in the weeks leading up to the murder. He had confided in close friends about his struggles, but no one had realized just how close he was to breaking. As investigators pieced together the timeline of events leading up to the murder, the narrative became clearer. Harris had been playing a dangerous game, using his position of authority to manipulate both Daniel and Jacob, pitting them against each other in a twisted triangle of jealousy and control. In the end, it was a game he couldn't win. The trial that followed became the most closely watched in Cedar Grove's history. The courtroom was packed every day, filled with students, faculty, media, and curious onlookers from the town. The prosecution aimed to paint a clear picture: Jacob Wright had committed premeditated murder, and Daniel Fisher, while present at the scene, had been an unwitting witness to the crime. But things weren't that simple, and as the trial unfolded, the layers of deceit, manipulation, and emotional entanglement began to take center stage. The prosecution leaned heavily on Jacob's confession. He had admitted to pulling the trigger, though his explanation pointed to a sudden loss of control rather than a calculated act of violence. His defense team, however, focused on Harris's manipulation and the toxic emotional environment he had fostered between the two young men. Jacob's attorneys argued that he had been pushed to the edge, his mental state deteriorating under the weight of Harris's control and Daniel's rivalry. Witnesses were called to testify, including students who had seen the dynamic between the three men. They described the tension, the subtle glances, and the obvious favoritism Harris displayed toward Jacob in the months leading up to the murder. A few recalled seeing Daniel grow increasingly agitated, his mood swinging from desperation to anger as Harris distanced himself. While these accounts didn't directly implicate Daniel in the murder, they painted a picture of a young man who was unraveling emotionally under the pressure of the fraught relationship. For his part, Daniel was portrayed as the tragic figure in the case, a talented athlete whose emotional dependence on Harris had left him vulnerable. His defense team focused on how Harris had exploited Daniel's insecurities, stringing him along with promises of a bright future while secretly building a similar relationship with Jacob. They argued that Daniel's presence at the scene of the crime was a coincidence, a young man caught in the wrong place at the worst possible time. However, there were inconsistencies in Daniel's story. While he maintained that he had no idea Jacob was carrying a gun that night, witnesses had heard him shouting at Harris during the confrontation, accusing him of betrayal. His anger, they said, was palpable, leading some to question just how innocent he really was in the chain of events that led to Harris's death. But could Daniel have known Jacob was on the verge of snapping? Was his appearance at Harris's office that night more than just a desperate plea or answers? The media latched onto these questions, spinning the trial into a tale of love, jealousy, and murder that gripped the nation. Headlines screamed of the campus love triangle and the coach's deadly game, turning the trial into a spectacle of sordid intrigue. The students of Fairview College, once proud of their institution's athletic prowess, now found themselves at the center of a national scandal. As the trial neared its conclusion, the defense for both Jacob and Daniel made their final pleas. Jacob's team begged for leniency, arguing that the coach's manipulation had led to a mental breakdown, a sudden eruption of violence that Jacob deeply regretted. Daniel's attorneys painted him as a victim, emotionally devastated by Harris's betrayal, but ultimately innocent of any criminal intent. Both young men were broken, their lives forever altered by the decisions of a man who had wielded far too much power over them. In the final days of the trial, the prosecution introduced one last piece of evidence, a chilling detail that had gone overlooked in the chaos. How a series of text messages between Daniel and Jacob revealed a disturbing exchange in the hours leading up to the murder. Daniel had sent Jacob a message warning him that Harris was about to discard them both, hinting at a confrontation. While it wasn't an explicit instruction to commit murder, the implication was clear. Daniel knew that something was about to happen, and he had done nothing to stop it. The jury was left to consider the complex emotional dynamics at play. Was Jacob a cold-blooded murderer, or a broken young man manipulated into violence by the very person he idolized? And what of Daniel? Was he an innocent bystander, or did he bear some responsibility for setting the tragedy in motion? The answers were far from clear. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdicts. For Jacob Wright, the decision was swift. To guilty of second-degree murder, they declared, rejecting the defense's argument that he had been driven temporarily insane by the emotional manipulation of Coach Harris. The courtroom was tense as the judge handed down the sentence: 30 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20. The severity of the sentence shocked many, but the jury's message was clear. No matter the emotional manipulation, Jacob had pulled the trigger and had to be held accountable. For Daniel Fisher, the verdict was more complicated. The jury acknowledged his emotional trauma and the manipulation he had suffered at the hands of Coach Harris. But the revelation of the text messages had cast a shadow of doubt over his innocence. So in the end, they acquitted him of any direct involvement in the murder, but the court of public opinion was far less forgiving. Daniel was a free man, but his reputation was in tatters. The whispers that he had played a more active role in pushing Jacob over the edge followed him wherever he went. Life after the trial proved to be an unrelenting struggle for both men. Jacob's sentence meant years of isolation behind bars, time to reflect on the devastating choices that had led him there. He became a figure of sympathy for some, especially those who viewed him as another victim of Harris's predatory behavior. But for many others, he was the boy who had taken a gun to his coach in a moment of blind rage. His future, once so full of promise, was reduced to the cold routine of prison life. Daniel, despite being acquitted, found no solace in his freedom. The trial had turned him into a pariah, both on campus and beyond. Fairview College distanced itself from the scandal, and Daniel's former teammates barely acknowledged him. His athletic career, once destined for greatness, was over before it had even truly begun. No professional team wanted the baggage of a player connected to such a gruesome case, and Daniel found himself drifting through life, struggling to make sense of his shattered identity. And the media attention eventually died down, but the scars of the tragedy lingered. Haddiger Grove, a town once known for its pristine college campus and successful sports programs, was now synonymous with betrayal, murder, and scandal. Coach Harris's legacy, once lauded, became a cautionary tale about the dangers of abusing power, particularly over vulnerable young lives. Though the full extent of his manipulation might never be known, the damage he had inflicted on Daniel and Jacob was undeniable. Years later, the football field where Coach Harris had once held court stood as a stark reminder of the tragedy. The grass had long since regrown, the stains of that fateful night washed away by time and nature. But for those who remembered, the shadow of Harris's death and the lives it destroyed remained ever present. Years passed, but the events at Fairview College left an indelible mark on the community and those involved in the tragedy. The football field, once the site of cheers and triumphs, had become a symbol of the school's darkest moment. Students who had been there that year graduated and moved on, but the stories of Coach Harris's murder lingered, handed down in whispers to incoming freshmen. It was a cautionary tale, one that overshadowed the school's athletic legacy and left a cloud hanging over the institution. Daniel Fisher struggled to find his place in a world that no longer saw him as the promising athlete he once was. After the trial, his attempts to rebuild his life were met with resistance at every turn. His name had become synonymous with scandal, and no matter how much he tried to distance himself from the events, it was impossible to escape the association. News outlets occasionally dredged up the story, reminding the public of the young athlete who had been at the center of the tragedy, stirring up old rumors about his role in the murder. Unable to return to the world of sports, Daniel drifted from job to job, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. His past followed him like a shadow, casting suspicion wherever he went. The media attention had left deep scars on his psyche, and the betrayal he felt from Coach Harris still haunted him. His once close friends from Fairview had all but disappeared, leaving him isolated in his guilt and shame. Meanwhile, Jacob Wright's life had taken an even darker turn. The prison system was not kind to a young man convicted of murder, especially one as emotionally fragile as Jacob. The violence and brutality of life behind bars wore down what little resolve he had left. Though he tried to avoid conflict, the reality of prison life meant that Jacob had to adapt or face the consequences. His mental health, already precarious, deteriorated further in the years following his conviction. He was no longer the hopeful, wide athlete who had once dreamed of a future in football. Now, he was just another inmate serving a long sentence for a crime he wished he could undo. Despite this, Jacob's case remained a point of debate in legal circles. Some believed that he had been failed by the system, that the emotional manipulation he had suffered at the hands of Coach Harris should have been more heavily weighed during the trial. Advocacy groups occasionally took up his cause, arguing that his sentence was too harsh for a crime committed in the heat of passion. But public sympathy remained split, with many viewing Jacob as dangerous, capable of impulsive violence that cost a man his life. Appeals were filed but repeatedly denied. Jacob was destined to serve out his sentence, with the possibility of parole still years away. The town of Cedar Grove, too, was forever changed by the events at Fairview College. So the murder of Coach Harris wasn't just a blip on the radar, it had become a defining moment in the town's history. For the residents, it was a reminder that even in a seemingly perfect community, darkness could lurk beneath the surface. Harris, once revered as a pillar of the athletic department, had been revealed as a flawed and deeply troubled man. The revelations about his personal life, his manipulative relationships with young men like Daniel and Jacob, left many wondering how such behavior had gone unnoticed for so long. Questions arose about the college's role in the tragedy, about whether anyone had turned a blind eye to Harris's inappropriate relationships out of fear of damaging the school's reputation. In the years that followed, Fairview College struggled to regain its footing. The administration launched investigations into the culture of the athletic department, enforcing stricter rules on student-coach relationships and instituting mandatory counseling services for athletes. But no amount of reform could undo the damage that had been done. Alumni donations dwindled, and the once thriving athletic program saw a sharp decline in recruitment. Fairview would never truly recover its former glory. While the public narrative seemed settled, there were still many questions left unanswered about the night of Coach Harris's murder. The court had decided Jacob's guilt and Daniel had been acquitted. Blum believed that the whole truth had come to light. Some people in the community, particularly those close to the case, remained convinced that Daniel had played a larger role than he had admitted. There were whispers that he had provoked Jacob, knowing full well the young man's fragile state of mind and that his hands were far from clean. Detective Sarah Graves, the lead investigator in the case, had always felt that something was missing. She had followed the evidence, presented her findings, and seen Jacob convicted, but there were pieces of the puzzle that never quite fit. During the investigation, Daniel had been evasive, and while he had cooperated with the authorities, there was always a sense that he wasn't telling the full story. Those cryptic text messages between Daniel and Jacob, for example, had raised red flags. They showed a level of communication and coordination that suggested Daniel had been more involved than he let on. Graves had gone through every piece of evidence more times than she could count, but there had never been enough to formally charge Daniel with anything more than being a witness. His defense team had skillfully cast him as a victim of Harris's manipulation, and in the absence of concrete proof, the court had no choice but to acquit him. Still, Detective Graves couldn't shake the feeling that justice hadn't been fully served. For years after the trial, she would occasionally revisit the case, poring over the details in her spare time. Every now and then, new information would trickle in: a former teammate of Daniel's who recalled something odd, or a student who claimed to have overheard a conversation. But it was all circumstantial, nothing strong enough to reopen the case. To Daniel, these lingering doubts haunted him more than anything else. He knew that some people believed he had manipulated Jacob, that he had set the stage for the murder without ever pulling the trigger. The weight of these suspicions was unbearable. Every time he tried to rebuild his life, it seemed that someone somewhere would bring up the past. He was never allowed to fully escape it. Jacob Sue suffered under the burden of unresolved guilt. Though he had confessed to the crime, the question of Daniel's involvement gnawed at him during his long hours in prison. He had been emotionally fragile, easily influenced, and in the aftermath of the shooting, his mind had been clouded by shock. He often wondered if Daniel had pushed him toward that moment of violence, if his friend had known what he was capable of and chosen to manipulate that vulnerability for his own purposes. But no matter how much either of them thought about it, the truth remained locked in the past, hidden in the shadows of that terrible night. The events had taken on a life of their own, reshaping their identities and futures. Both Daniel and Jacob were prisoners, one behind bars, and the other behind a wall of guilt and suspicion. The tragedy had consumed them both, leaving them to forever wrestle with the consequences of that brief, violent encounter.